We've got people flowing in, but as we get started, I would like to thank everybody for coming back this afternoon. Hope everybody's had a good little bit of a chance to have a break today. I know yesterday we kind of ran over a little bit, so our break was shorter. So hopefully everybody is refreshed, ready to get back into it. I would like to introduce our presenter for this afternoon. This is Susie Morgan Morrow. And she is the director. Name sign is Susie. Yep, she is the director of the New York Deafblind Project. She's also an interpreter, deafblind interpreter, all of the magical hats that she has. So we are very thankful to have her here with us this afternoon. I have seen this presentation previously and it is very powerful. And so I'm happy you all are with us this afternoon to experience it. So Susie, I will turn it over to you.
Great. All right. I'm not sure if that pun was intended, but you said it was powerful, and that's the name of the presentation, The Power of Touch. So that was a good little segue. I imagine someone will keep an eye on the questions in the chat box. Already we have one about a code for the afternoon, assuming there is something like that.
Oh, thank goodness. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, there is a code for this afternoon for ACV REP credits. And the code for this afternoon is, the opening code is SUN, S-U-N. SUN.
That's seriously a joke with today's weather, right?
That is true.
Yeah.
If you are in Maryland, there is a lack of sun. But we're hopeful for the future. So yes, opening code is SUN. And somebody remind me if I forget, at the very end of this, I will post the link in the chat to our evaluation survey, which will link you automatically to a certificate for being with us for these 2 days. So thank you. Thank you.
All right, great. All right, on that note, I am going to mute everybody just so we can manage background interference and all that craziness. I am really happy to be here. I'm always happy to do work with my awesome colleagues. So as Jen said, so I basically do the same job in New York State that they do for you all in Maryland. So we all have the same responsibilities, same mandates on our federal grant to provide support for children and young adults who have both hearing and vision loss between the ages of 0 to 22. And so, as you might imagine, that is a very big task. It is a very broad population. The needs and the communication preferences and everything else are extremely varied. The lived experiences are extremely wide. So we have the good fortune of learning lots of different things and figuring ways that we can bring what we know and what we've learned over time as some of the sort of best practices in deafblind education and bring them to a wider audience. So this is a great way. I mean, this is one of the ways that Zoom helped us out, right? With the pandemic, that we can reach out and have better and more distant conversations. So, but of course we have to laugh. We're talking about the concept of touch and we're on screen in a two-dimensional world. So ironic, but we'll try to hit home in ways that make sense in terms of your own application. I'd love to ask if you can just put in the chat box, if you could just indicate your role, if you are a professional or a parent, and if you're a professional, what hat you're wearing. Like Jen said, we all have a lot of hats, but what is your main hat, and what that gives me a picture of kind of who's here. Oh, great. We have a good variety. Awesome. So we have a parent, we've got some speech folks, teachers of the deaf, TVIs. Oh my gosh, this is so great. Our friend Erin is here from the Delaware Deafblind Project. Awesome. Oh, Paige, I think we just saw each other at PDM in DC. I'm pretty sure.
We did. It's great to see you again.
Awesome. Great, great. All right, good. Thank you for that. That's super helpful. It gives me a better picture of who's in the room, a very diverse group, which is great. Then my next question is, has anyone worked with students who are deafblind? And of course, we can, of course, debate what that definition is. And I think that maybe some of this has been part of your conversation. Oh my gosh. Hi, Donna Sauerberger with exclamation points of yes. Donna, who wrote the book on O&M with deafblind students. Fabulous to see you here. Great. Okay, this is nice that people are actually saying yes, because a lot of times people are saying, absolutely not. I don't know who those kiddos are, and I don't work with them. And we normally start the conversation with saying, if you've worked with kids who have hearing loss, kids with vision loss, then you most likely have worked with kids who we would consider to be deafblind, right? Who have a dual experience, right? Some sort of, if your hearing is compromised and your vision is compromised, right? It's no more a matter of addition. It's not 1 + 1. It becomes an issue of multiplication, right? It's no longer mild plus mild does not equal mild. And so it sounds like that's a foundational understanding that this group already has, which is really great. Since I happen to also be an interpreter, that like Jen said, and I've spent my entire career with the good fortune of interpreting with deafblind adults and young adults, I've had the good fortune of learning alongside, and that has really shaped my perspective as a hearing sighted professional in this field. And so working with Collaborative, I know one of the other interpreters long-term just met a new friend here. And so we just agreed that as I use certain terms, I may throw out signs, like signs that we know that we are using in the field that is either given to us or created by deaf-blind people, which is exactly what we want, right? Deaf and deaf-blind people, so that we're all just kind of learning together and continuing to grow, right? So a few already, you may have seen me say, I said sighted, like people who can see. So it's, you take the middle fingers and they flick off of your cheekbone. So it's someone who's sighted. That's a sign you may not have used or seen before. And also for the context of this conversation, when I talk about loss, it's not going to be this loss. Interpreters often default, and I'm not pointing to our interpreters, but interpreters often default to this progressive sign of loss. But in fact, we're talking about a category, right? The noun of the something of a loss. And so in that case, we'll be using signs like it'll just be hearing loss. So we'll go ahead and spell it because it's a catch-all, as opposed to indicating the progression of loss. Because if we're talking about congenital, born with, that means that there most likely is not a progression. It's something that the child has and could be stable for the rest of their experience, as opposed to other types of causes that, yes, may in fact have a condition that will progress. But for this context, just wanted to kind of put that in mind. Okay, so to set the stage, kind of this conversation, again, I started my career actually at my learning at Gallaudet. So I did my master's there in rehabilitation counseling for the deaf. And of course, so I was in the deaf community, deaf field. And that was when I had met the first deaf-blind person I had ever met in my life. And of course, like most people were thinking, wow, how do you take this visual access to visual information and make it accessible? So like everyone is really just trying to figure that out. And then my first job after my degree was at Helen Keller National Center. So I went full on from deaf stuff into deaf blindness overnight, and then had the good fortune of being with dozens of deaf-blind adults on a daily basis, and who could really tell you what worked and didn't work for communication, what worked and didn't work for guiding, what worked and didn't work for touch. And that's exactly the information that we need. Because if you start off, and if your experience is working with children, maybe it's children who don't necessarily have language fluency or do not have the capacity to tell you or verbally tell you or clearly tell you what works and what doesn't work, then we in that environment don't always make the best choices, right? And a lot of times we're trying to make it on our best guess, of course, with our best of intentions. Nobody ever intends to do something that's disrespectful or that's actually disempowering to an individual. You know, we're in this field because we want to bolster up and empower people. But sometimes our actions actually go the opposite direction incidentally. So coming from working with the adult deafblind community and then kind of over years have shifted and now working with children and young adults, kind of marrying the two opposite ends of the spectrum has been extremely informative to me to be able to see the breadth of the life experience from kiddos who are very impacted and have very complex needs, students with multiple disabilities, including hearing and vision issues, all the way up to those folks who are, you know, college grads, masters, PhDs, but just happen to have a hearing and vision issue. So we're talking about an extremely broad stroke of experiences, all within kind of one community, shall we say, or one sort of label. So that is what kind of has led me to this conversation. Because I see working with children and younger folks who have emerging language, right? So we used to use terms like low functioning deaf and, you know, different terminology. But if we consider more of individuals who have emerging language skills, that is a better way probably to look at that, because we can build learning about language is scaffolding of learning, right? And so any individual can be emergent in their communication and can grow. And so I've just felt over time that if we are teaching young learners, why are we not looking to those who can lead us, who are deafblind adults, who can tell us what works, what doesn't work, and taking the principles that deafblind people know work for them and then apply those to young learners. So that's kind of the basis of this talk. And it will be, this is one of my favorite things to talk about, because I feel like the gap between those two the divide has been quite large, and we're starting to see some connections between what's happening with deafblind adults. And if you are familiar with or have heard of protactile language, so with PT, or sometimes it's called PTL, that's evolved from the deafblind adult community, starting to make its way to younger children, and that is just so exciting for us as a field. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those things as we go on. All right, I heard that there are some questions that may have come up in the earlier session or yesterday about, yeah, what is this protactile thing, and what is haptics, and are those the same, and what is this about? So as we go on the conversation, we'll talk about some of those things. All right. I know we're all having this interesting Zoom camera experience. Both Cheryl and I had our backgrounds all set up perfectly, and then Zoom changes its mind. So I guess we're just gonna live with the fringes. So all right, so this is kind of a quick overview, and I've kind of already kind of dove right into that, but you're talking about why touch is important. And actually get a little bit into, we're going to dip our toes a little bit into the science behind touch. I'm no neurologist, you know, but we're going to get into a few of those pieces and look at some terms like tactile cognition. What does that mean? And why touch is important, because it leads to this idea of sort of self-actualization. We'll talk about that. And some things I mentioned to you about what can we learn from deafblind adults, and what are some of the things that we know are already available to us as educators, as related service providers, as parents. Any of these things we talk about today absolutely can and should be applied within the home, right? We want consistency across all environments. And so home being the mainstay, the key to all of this is really so exciting to have parents in the audience. So that's great. Okay, so diving right in. So why touch is important. So I think that any of us who work in a school environment know that we still today, even though we use words like collaborative teaming, interdisciplinary planning, you know, we meaning everybody who's on the IEP team should really come together and plan together. And we know, you know, given the time constraints of life and the way the school systems operate, that's not always possible. And so oftentimes we still really are working in a siloed fashion, right? If you're a teacher for the deaf, you often think that in terms of your access. And then if you're a teacher for the blind, same thing, speech, all that. So hopefully though, among the team, what we do know is, okay, do we have the audiogram? Can the team interpret that? You know, do we have the vision report? Can the team interpret that? And we often have all of these pieces and we have to get them all together in a holistic way for a student who is deafblind. But one big thing that I would argue to say that is absent in this is the concept of touch. And the idea of touch can be quite taboo, right? Depending on what part of the country you live in, what a family's background is, what is the policy in a school. There could be lots and lots of factors that either welcome and embrace touch or absolutely not only shy away from it, but forbid it. And for our kiddos, that's a problem, right? So if you can't access auditory information from a distance or even close by, then that means your access to the world is compromised. It is impacted in a way. Same thing for your vision, right? So if you know about the sensory system, those are our distant senses. And that means that we get a lot of information at a distance that helps build our understanding of the world, helps us build our knowledge about even our own immediate surroundings, and allows us to make decisions to move forward. And that literally means to move my body forward in the world, right? So if those things are compromised, then and we have a sense of touch, another very, very strong, consistent sense, why are we not using that as a constant to enhance access to that individual's access to the world around them? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. All right. So if we get a little bit into science, there are two pathways in the brain that process touch. Like we are wired for this, right? Every human being is wired for this and is kind of prepared, unless there's a unique incident, right? So of course we can have kiddos that come into the world that, let's say, at birth, they experience a malseizure. They have like something massive happens, you know, and then there's some sort of impact or fingerprint left on the brain in a certain area. Sure, that could have impact, right? But for the most part, we are all sort of wired in this fashion. So the first way looks at, is able to interpret discriminative touch. That's the facts about the things in our environment. It's the facts about touch, right? So it's when something vibrates, you feel pressure. You know where things are in the location just by reaching out to them, right? Think about the clothing that you wearing. Do you pick a certain type of fabric because it feels a certain way? It gives you information. So being able to reach out and touch something, you know, allows you to interpret that in a way that is either pleasurable, welcoming, dissatisfying, etc. Right? Some people have texture issues when it comes to food, right? You know, I'm not a custard person. Yeah. And I don't know if it's the flavor or is it actually just the touch of it, the way it feels, right? So Gosh, I remember when I was a kid, you know, probably 5 years old, my poor mother, I wouldn't put those socks on because if the line of those socks didn't go right across my toes, I wasn't wearing them, right? And it was something that it was related to the discriminative touch, the information that my body received from that, right? So that can apply in all the things you can think about. So, so just kind of set our stage with that. Let's think about that. Then how do I, you know, experience discriminative touch? And so let's do a quick little exercise since we can't do this in person and actually touch, right? So I'm going to stop screen sharing for just a second and I'm going to switch screens. And if you happen to have access to hearing, either way, if you do or you don't, but if you do have access to hearing, I would ask that you make sure your speakers are on, because I'm going to turn something on. And if you do not use hearing, we will apply it the same way. All right, so what I'm going to ask you is, I'm going to do this real quick. So I'm going to turn on a little white noise, one of my favorite things to kind of chill out. And I should have set the stage. I live in New York City. And as I said that, a horn just beeped outside. So I am very used to a lot of auditory stimulation, oftentimes a little too much auditory stimulation. And so there are ways and practices that we can kind of get ourselves back into our bodies, right? Get ourselves back centered. So what I ask you to do right now is I'm just going to, oh, wait, Jen told me I have to share the screen with sound. See, we are all learners. Okay, let me do that again. Thank you for that. Okay, so I'm going to play this. And so I want you to, if you are using some hearing, you know, I'm going to ask you next to close your eyes and just listen as this white noise kind of drowns out the background sound. If you are watching the interpreter, then I'm going to ask you to do just the same thing as to close your eyes. And what I'm asking you during that brief time, we'll do this for maybe about 20 seconds, 30 seconds, is I want you to literally sit in your body wherever you are and feel what you feel. And think about what you're feeling. And then you're going to reach out with your eyes closed and feel the things around you. Okay? And then we're going to come back and reflect. All right. See if we go back, get all of our friends back. All right, so that was only about we already got a wow from Donna. Okay, so I want to ask you to use the chat box and say, so think about that's only about 20, 30 seconds of your life. Probably felt a little longer. And now think about what did you feel in your body? Because think about, we also have our internal mechanisms. You could also be having a stomach ache. You know, you just had your lunch and it didn't sit well with you, right? So we have all those internal things going on. But tell me, just put in the chat box, what stood out to you in that experience about whether your clothing, or what did you notice that you probably weren't paying attention to before? We'll give folks a second or two to type some things in. Okay, so if we get away from the auditory aspect, right? It's literally just thinking about, were you able to get into your body or whatever body we were in, and the sense of touch, what you felt. Someone felt cold. Donna said, I never noticed things like this before. Can't put a finger on it. Distracted and things probably felt heightened. Interesting. Really slowed down to feel around, anxious to knock something over. Okay, so that's so interesting how we automatically put different. I'm asking you for the factual information, and it's almost like we can't help it but respond with an emotional experience with that. So you see how it automatically overlaps. But if we try to look at just the facts, what was it? Someone said cold, right? Oh, that's a factual experience. Like, oh, I felt colder than I started to notice I was feeling cold, right? Had difficulty getting into my body because of the different textures, right? So maybe something is distracting, right? I reached out for my bottle and I actually felt the back of it with my hand first, and I felt that it was cold, right? So that was information to me. More aware of what I was touching. Normally I tune out those touches, right? Very, very much so. And we have to, right? We have to, there are things that we automatically have to, if we didn't do that, we would be just endlessly distracted, right? Jen is saying everything felt familiar because I had prior experience with them. Right. So so obviously exposure is critical. Felt annoyed, couldn't think of anything or pay attention. Aha, found things in my environment that I didn't recognize. Right. All right, good. Thank you. So thank you for being with me in that. Now let's go back. So you can see how the facts about your environment are important, right? They give you a lot of information, and whether you're able, some things you're able to tune out, and meaning tune out in terms of even touch, and other things you can't, right? What about that time, you wore those new business pants, right? And you went to work and all of a sudden you were like, ooh, that waist is a little tighter than I realized. And all day you have this annoying, pressure on your body in a way that you hadn't experienced. And when we have even those sort of instances of heightened discriminative touch, it makes it harder to pay attention, right? Some of us, Donna and Aaron and Paige and I just got back from a very, very big conference in DC just yesterday. And for me, in hotels, freezing cold. It was absolutely freezing cold. You would think that polar bears were walking by any moment because it was freezing. And for me, it makes it very difficult to stay attuned to what someone is saying. So, we have to think about what can we do physically that will help us stay more, be more available to learn, essentially, be more readily available for communication. And I should have brought a parka. That's what I'm saying. I should have brought gloves and a scarf, and I would have been happier. And we're switching into Bruce. Okay, so now I said that the brain processes touch in two ways, right? So now the second part is what you already sort of dove into. It's the social emotional connection that we have to touch, right? So we have the facts, and then we have the emotional experience related to that touch. So you already started responding that way. And that's the thing, that's all this information that we get, mostly from, skin to skin touch. And that's where all those receptors are. And the thing about it is that we really cannot separate those two. And so my next question for you is then, think about touch then that had a feeling. And some of you just responded that way, but think about it now as it relates to an interaction with someone else. We have all sorts of responses, going home or going to my grandma's house and walking in and smelling the baking that she did. So that's the olfactory sense that is so deeply embedded also and attuned to memories, right? So we have those. And what about that? What about Aunt Sally, who gives you that big bear hug every time she sees you, right? But then there's other sort of senses of touch that have a negative emotion connected to them. And those are the things that we have to think about, how we feel them, how we make them connected, but then how are the students that we're working with experience those same things? All right, so this is where these two components merge. We really, again, I was saying, we really cannot separate those two. It is very, very rare that there's, this concept of touch blindness, where someone may have a very unique experience where there's damage to the central nervous system. There's some sort of traumatic brain injury I had mentioned before, a stroke that has a direct impact to where the somatosensory processing center is. So that obviously can happen, but in general, all humans experience the sense of touch. And you can see how, right, one is connected to the other. The discriminative piece with the emotional connection or the emotional response. So here's where we get a little sciencey, right? So this image, right? So is if you take, a snapshot of the brain, right? And then you turn it up, and this is just one section of it. And so then scientists, they've been able to get in there and figure out literally where and in what part of what lobe of the brain do we experience certain things. And if you haven't seen this before, it is quite fascinating. And the sizes of these images of the parts of the body are supposed to be representative of how much that plays a part of the sense of the experience. So think about this. Look at how big the hand is represented in this picture, because it shows up in more places. It has more real estate, shall we say, right, in the brain. And so that means we have a lot of ability to receive information in the palm, on the back of the hand, the elbow, forearm. It's all indicated all the way here. The foot and the toes around here, but it tells us even more information of how critical and how much information we can get from the hands. And as that relates to kids who are deafblind, right, that if an individual needs to either communicate using their hands, needs to use their hands to seek information in their environment, that we then, as the communicators, educators, therapists, parents, need to consider then, how are we engaging them with those hands of that young developing individual, right? We are most likely either saying, yes, please touch, my touch to you is welcoming, or we may be saying the exact opposite, right? And so that's kind of the way I'm trying to get us to kind of frame this conversation and thinking about the kiddos that we're talking about. So now we almost have to flip that around. Like, then let's think about, okay, so what happens then when there is the absence of touch or the presence of negative touch? And there are actually a lot of studies, and this is the science side of things, like actual studies of how does, when the physiological components are either absent or leave a negative imprint, then how does that lead to long-term growth and development? And this stuff is fascinating. And I think this is stuff we should be looking more at if we are educators in the classroom, because how are we using touch, again, in a way, in those early developmental years that will set the stage for as that child progresses throughout their life, right? Sorry, I should have said trigger warning, just for a little warning of a little kiddo who's got a lot of things going on. But we know that a lot of the kids that we work with, a lot of the kids of focus of this conversation come into the world pretty darn complicated, right? They present with a whole host of things. And if we frame this now in thinking about when we think of the word touch, and now we look at this little infant, what has happened in this newborn's life the second they came onto this earth, right? The second they came into this big but wide world, obviously there was a lot of intervention, and all of that can only be connected to negative touch, right? If infants are whisked away to NICUs because they need to, we have to prioritize surviving and thriving, right? That is invasive and necessary interventions. However, we have to really consider what sort of impact and what sort of imprint is that leaving on the development of that child. And this is a very good relatable picture because this is a picture of a newborn who came to the world with CHARGE syndrome, CHARGE. And so in case you haven't seen that time before, it's C to CS, off the shoulders. And so CHARGE syndrome, and if you didn't see on social media yesterday, was the inaugural CHARGE syndrome awareness day on August 8th, because that was the day that it was published of the identifying gene of CHARGE. So, but anyway, CHARGE is a syndrome that causes a whole host of complications. And of those complications, most likely is both hearing and vision. So we have a lot of kiddos with CHARGE who are registered with all of us on the state projects. And as you might imagine then, that this child, again, needs lots of interventions. And that means there's lots and lots of touch, but most likely is not connected to a positive experience. So that means by the time this child comes to you, maybe they are in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th grade. And so then we have to go all the way back and really knowing the family history. What's the social history of this child? Because maybe by the time they got to you, they're through all those crazy medical interventions. They're stable. They're physiologically in a good place, but that means that all that history is brought with them. It's carried with them. And so then when we hear things like, oh, that child, they're aversive to touch. Like they're resistant. They are unwilling to communicate. We hear a lot of those sort of things, touch resistant. And a lot of times, and that's because we have to think of like, okay, but where did that come from? Right. We see kids, people say, well, I tried to do hand under hand. I tried to do respectful communication, but the child is resistant. They pull away. That's the words I was looking for. They're tactily defensive, right? We hear that phrase a lot. And that's because we have to think like, well, are they tactily defensive, or they're actually just in the mode of self-preservation because of all of the touch experiences they have had throughout their lives. Right, so there's some other really great studies then looking at then how does the absence of touch or the impact of negative touch, how does that impact children then developmentally? Because we look at developmental delays in different ways. So here's a good quote. I'll read it. Much evidence now points to the importance of touch in child development and suggests the possibility that these orphaned infants are not suffering from maternal deprivation, but from sensory deprivation, and more specifically, a deprivation of mechanosensory stimulation. So there's a lot of studies around infants who are in orphans. And so if we want to look at the absence of touch, that's a place to go. And they've done a lot of studies. And so then starting to figure out that, we need to intentionally insert touch in the development of these young babies' lives, because again, not that it's necessarily the maternal deprivation, which of course is critical, but it's the lack of stimulation in all of the senses, and which leads to significant global developmental delays in the child. So then you may have heard of something called kangaroo care. If you are a parent, if you birth a child, or you have a child, the idea then of kangaroo care is that the second that an infant comes into the world, that it is placed directly on the skin of either the birth parent or a parent who will be the caregiver as soon and as quickly as possible. Skin to skin. It's supposed to be bare skin to bare skin, because we talked about all those sensory components and the ability to interpret touch through the sense of touch on skin. And that there are actual studies that show the physiological changes in an infant, the second that newborn comes in contact with the parent, that literally that their breathing patterns start to become in sync. A crying baby that's agitated and scared starts to calm down, right? And that truly is a physiological response from this mechanosensory stimulation that the baby is able to interpret. And so if you think about this and we think, so we take this piece now and we think about that little infant that had to be whisked away to the NICU, right? And to life-saving measures, they're already deprived of this from the very second that they've entered the world. So I'm just bringing this to our attention to think about like, okay, then how does that continue to build over time, right? And we know, and if you have a child, doesn't matter what life experience of the child. If you have a kid who's had a negative experience in the medical environment, right? Number one, could also be in the educational environment. But I have a child who is able-bodied, who had a slight negative experience with a needle as a young child and has developed a pretty significant phobia to shots, right? And so you think we think like, oh, that's so silly. It's all in your head. Well, it's in your head because it's ingrained in such a deep place that those are the things that we have to try to see. Can we help unlearn them? Can we retrain the brain? And the good part is we'll talk about how the malleability of the brain having the capacity to actually learn different things. All right, so I just have to put cute pictures of cute babies in here. It makes a big difference, right? But really, it also talks about how that skin-to-skin connection also helps that infant manage pain in ways that we wouldn't be able to otherwise measure. They're able to see those differences between infants and young children who experience pain, whether it's through multiple medical interventions or the actual physiological condition they have, are able to tolerate and manage pain much better than infants who do not have this this exposure to touch early on. So then we look at well, what are the long-term effects then? It's like, well, there are studies that show that truly with these early exposure and constant respectful uses of touch can lead to very impactful, positive long-term effects. And that's exactly what we need to understand and need to see. Better cognitive skills, increased executive functioning skills, more organized sleep. I mean, these are some real physiological connections that allow us to manage ourselves and achieve at higher levels. Even how it stimulates the endocrine system and things like that, which are really critical for balance in many ways overall. So then also interesting to know that we lose the sense of touch, our touch receptors. Remember, we saw the picture of the hand and how much access to information that we can glean. But over time, those sensitive touch receptors do start to fade away in terms of their sharpness and their ability to interpret touch. And so you would know this if you are an orientation mobility instructor, a teacher for the blind, because you know that if you want to teach someone Braille or be able to interpret touch in their environment and learn that later in life, it's much harder than if they were exposed when they were younger, right? So like, for example, individuals who have Usher syndrome, right? So those folks have a progressive vision loss. They have this one, right? Where their vision begins to change over time. And as that happens, that individual moves from living their life, most likely as a deaf-sighted person. They came into the world deaf or hard of hearing and relied on their vision their entire lives until their vision started to present itself as problematic. Well, at that point, someone who might be then not interested and actually quite resistant to learning Braille, because if their identity is as a deaf person, that is quite a shift, right? And thinking it's not only about access, it's also about who am I in my world? What happened to my cultural and community identity, right? So someone may then postpone the learning of an access that they really need.
Sorry, Susie, our interpreters are not working the spotlighting thing. Miss Mamark. Gotcha. I'm gonna help switch over everybody.
That's okay.
There we go.
We're in a tech world. It's all good.
You guys had it this morning, and then this afternoon, you know, the coffee has dwindled, and so we all need a little help. Got it.
All right, so the idea around it would make sense. Like just giving the example of someone who has a specific life experience who may have Usher syndrome, like I was saying, you know, there's a lot of factors that come into that. And so then they may take them a while to get to the point of even accepting the idea that they need to shift to more of a tactile mode of access, which means perhaps tactile sign language, access to Braille. And so again, then the bad news is then we don't have as much access, meaning directly connected in like a faster, you know, highway connection to the brain that we would have before. And this is, I thought this number was quite astonishing, that they tend to peak around the age of 16 to 18. That's pretty wild. And so then already begin to fade. Like nobody likes to think about aging, especially when you hit a certain age, because then we think everything's going south. Well, here's the good and the bad news. The bad news is it goes south further than we realize at an earlier age, right? But then that means the good news is we know that those early years, we could pack in so much more that could really prepare someone, again, going forward, right? Let's make this environment more accessible, more welcoming with a multi-sensory approach, you know, I think with the concept of touch really being the mainstay. So the idea being the early introduction, the better. As with anything, right? If you are someone who is multilingual, you know, we know the research is out there. We know if you expose an infant to 1, 2, 3, 4 languages and a consistent basis over time, they will very easily be able to recognize it. The brain has the ability to sift through all that stuff and know. You try to pick up a language at this age and it's like, hold on, Duolingo. Hold on, I got to repeat, right? It's like, we just don't have that malleability like we did when we were young. All right. So before we get into some fancier terms, since I can't see you all, are we still here? And if so, how is everything okay? Give me a thumbs up in the chat box, or you can say, no, this is not going well for me. And we will attempt to shift. All right, good. This gives me a chance for a water break too. Okay, great, good. And engaged, even better, because it is absolutely Friday afternoon. Like Jen said, we are late in the week, and I just want to commend you all for sticking in there at the end of the week in the summer. So there we go. All right, so because of my interest in this stuff and looking at deafblind adults and how can we connect it with children, I stumbled on the research of Jude Nicholas, who is on the screen, who is out of the Netherlands and who has done lots and lots of work in more of the science aspect of touch. And so he talks a lot about this idea of tactile cognition. And so you put the words together and you can kind of figure it out, right? So it's tactile cognition refers to the higher order processing and integration of tactile information through active touch. So meaning, like any learning, that it scaffolds, right? We can't go from learning 1, 2, 3, and then let's do calculus. That doesn't work, right? So we have to scaffold learning. So he proposes it's the same idea when it comes to the sense of touch. You can't just expose somebody to something once and expect them to be able to then extrapolate this idea and apply it to something totally random, right? You can't expect something to give someone something once and be like, oh, of course, that's the thing that does all the things, right? So we have to be able to scaffold the understanding and the interpretation of touch in this understanding of the brain, and with the emphasis on through the sense of active touch. And so he spends a lot of time talking about, well, what does active touch mean? And what does that look like? So this is not a new idea to those of us who work in the field of deafblindness, or if you work in working with students with multiple disabilities, because we always center the idea of learning and communication around the sense of touch. So there are some kind of well-established, understood sort of best practices when it comes to touch and learning for deafblind communicators. And so the idea then is we have to consider then, how do we develop tactile cognition, like a real understanding of the sense of touch for students who may who really may need touch as some of their mainstays. So here are some of these ideas that have been developed over time, and I am on the heels of pioneers before me who have really written very, very eloquently about this, but really have identified some of these sort of best practices. And I would challenge you to consider your use of touch in these ways. So active touch has to be touch that is constant and repetitive, right? And we can use a simple example of, if I give my baby, let's say my child, we're going to frame it. This is a child who has impacted vision and impacted hearing. So that's the baby we're talking about. Well, if I present the bottle in front of the child, and at other times I present the bottle on the side of the child, and another time I present the bottle and I just put it in their hand. Another time I touch their arm, right? So it's the idea of, what is this thing? And what am I doing with it? And if I'm doing it differently every single time, I'm going to confuse the heck out of this child, right? How are we supposed to develop a clear understanding? So touch has to be meaningful and has to be intentional, right? And of course, the bottom line is also respectful. And that means, and we'll talk about some specific, like sort of touch techniques and strategies, and why one might be more respectful than the other. And then there's this idea of shared tactile exploration. Those are words we use more in the past and we see in the literature, but there's definitely some newer terms and some new language coming out from deafblind adults that's part of this pro-tactile sort of movement, and that's referred to as co-presence. And co-presence, present. So like being here, being present. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So think about that in the idea of, do with, not for, of course. And that means as simple as, let's say I was working with a family, and we went into the family's home, a child who is deafblind, no access to vision, and some hearing, some auditory, environmental information, but not really for language access. So this is really truly a tactile kid, but no one had really presented information in a way, because of course we do what we do, right? We think, well, but they can still hear me pretty well. So we should be relying on auditory information for communication, right? I mean, they tested at, only a 45 dB loss. Well, we know that's right in the mild, moderate range. But what we don't know is how is that auditory information being processed in the brain, right? There's other things going on in there. So maybe that child has a processing issue, right? So they're not using their vision. They have hearing loss. So why are we not presenting things in a tactile sense? And thinking about then, even we said to the family, because they were saying, well, she's having a hard time at mealtime, that she is being resistant at food time. She seems uninterested in eating, and that seemed to be a shift. It's like, okay, well, she had just turned, I think, 9 or 10. It's like, well, every body, right, goes through different changes over time. And so then something may have shifted with her internally. She's growing, but also thinking about those early developmental years. It's like, okay, well, how has she always been, quote, fed? How has she participated in mealtime? You know, so did anybody ever go with her to the kitchen? Like, does she know, like, where does the food come from? Right? It's like, well, poof, it just appears on her plate and she's supposed to eat it. And so this is a good example. And this is literally a bit of an eye opener for me, where it's like, right, because if you are, think about those 20, 30 seconds you sat there with your eyes closed and something could have just magically appeared to you without warning. And then if something just appears to you without warning, why would you have an interest in exploring where it came from? You wouldn't even know you were supposed to have an interest in exploring where it came from, right? So these are those intentional shared explorations, tactile explorations, that are going to be critical for the development and understanding in young children, right? I think that when we put it in that frame, it makes really good sense, right? Like, does she know that this plate came from the kitchen? Okay, let's start off in the kitchen then, right? And then, but who makes the food? And how does she know that someone's making the food unless she's literally with the person making the food, right? So we have to peel it back all the way. So shared exploration, shared experiences together will help build those concepts, because then that also builds this this welcoming idea of, oh, you're touching something, then I can touch that too, right? So it helps build a lot of things, which leads right into this conversation. So if we have this sort of invitation to touch, and that means if I'm doing something and I'm making myself available to you, then that will invite you to explore more with me, right? And then in doing so consistently over time, then will lead to this idea of self-actualization. And excuse me, and I'll tell you more what that means. Right? Because I think we live in a world where we talk a lot about self-determination. Like, we are all about, you know, how do we raise kids to be independent? It's like, well, we actually probably want to raise kids to be interdependent, right? None of us are really completely independent. We rely on other people in our environments, whether they're close by or at a distance. We create networks for ourselves. So we really are more interdependent, but we put a lot of emphasis around the child needs to learn to be more self-determined. And I'm cracking up because we talked about this beforehand and you just did this, and then Cheryl got a thumbs up on her screen. So it actually was perfect timing, because we're like, how do we become, you know, more self-actualized? And so there's some different concepts around that. So I kind of like to think of it more this way, you know, this idea of self-actualization. And if you haven't heard this term before, but more of, you know, oh wait, the interpreters are changing again. Let's wait. If you guys just give me a heads up, I'll stop so you can switch. I think someone needs to do the spotlight. There we go. Perfect. So this term self-actualization really means a process of growing in ways that enhances the idea of self, right? The process of growing into becoming who you are. So that's a really important process. How do I find me, right? How do I know me? So that's going to be something that is going to be developmental, right? That in those early years, in the early beginnings of self. Right? And then we have this concept of self-concordance, which I think is really interesting and also helps us think like, okay, so once I kind of maybe know a little bit about who I am, well, then what about my own sense of self and my values and my beliefs? So if I start to know myself, and I can only do that by learning about what's around me, about concepts in the world, and learning about where I fit in that world, and then understanding like, oh, I feel aligned with that thing or that belief, helps me then behave in a way that is connected to my internal beliefs and value system. which then ultimately leads to being self-determined or having self-determined behaviors. And so, right, what self-determination is really having, which I think these are critical words, having the ability and the power to choose for oneself. And what we know, of course, just based on, disability history in our society, about people doing for and not with and being disempowered. So I think we have a better raised awareness about that. But I don't think we think about it in these instances where, again, it's not going from learning 1, 2, 3 and then calculus. I cannot become a self-determined person if I haven't had opportunities to achieve some sort of sense of self-actualization. If I don't have these basic concepts about who I am, where am I safe in my environment? Who are the people in my environment? What are these things? How can I really move ahead? And ultimately, those are the things that we want to see, right, in the young children that we teach, that we're with, who are in our families, to become more self-actualized and self-determined individuals. All right. So that takes me to a little clip that I want to show you that helps sort of emphasize these points. So some of you may know, if you're in the field, you may know this mom. So Heather Withrow is a mom who is also a professional and has a personal life experience related to this conversation, because she is a deaf mom married to a deaf dad who had 3 kids, and they got the roll of the genetic dice. And of those 3 kids, they have one that's deaf, one that's hearing, and one that's deafblind. So that's quite the multi-sensory experience all in one family, right? And so Heather and her husband, deaf-sighted individuals, met at college, went on to have a family, and didn't necessarily know their own cause of hearing loss. And come to find out, they are both have Waardenburg type 2. Yeah, it's Waardenburg's, whatever. It's type 2. But it's type 2. So a lot of syndromes, like some we may be familiar with as sort of like the main one, but there's oftentimes, different types of these different syndromes. So Waardenburg type 1 is often known as the one that has a white stripe down the middle of the hair. There's an absence of pigmentation, has significant profound hearing loss, oftentimes one blue eye, one brown eye, some very clear characteristics, but there's no vision issue. There's no loss of vision in that experience. Waardenburg type 2 is oftentimes someone who is born more hard of hearing, deaf, has the same color eyes, doesn't have the white stripe. So it presents itself in a different way. But in the genetic roll of the dice, if you know about recessive conditions, right? When it's a recessive condition, that means both parents have to be carriers, right? And even so, if both parents are carriers, it's still a 1 in 4 chance that recessive condition could actually turn into the condition, right? So then of those 4 chances, one person could have that condition. It could manifest from the 2 recessive genes. 2 of those chances would be carriers, but not impacted themselves. And then another person would not, there's a chance of not even being a carrier at all. So it is truly just the way the genetic dice rolls out. So in this case, they had no idea that Waardenburg type 2 plus Waardenburg type 2 as a recessive condition can cause deaf blindness. And not only deaf blindness, but a host of other things. Albinism, so absence of pigmentation, low motor control, low motor tone, things like that. So, so you might imagine then they were a bit surprised, but did know in utero that something was different. The baby was really tiny, was not developing at a typical rate. So they had some news of this going into, but didn't really know exactly how what the impact might look like in the child. So, so I want to frame this in this way, because think about this, right? You've got deaf parents who already are visual communicators. So you have people who already are used to navigating their world in a way that isn't always really accessible to them, most likely, right? There are deaf people in a hearing world, so they're already used to managing and communicating, and these are folks who have higher level, degrees, have gone on, to pursue careers, and so had a base knowledge about this, and also had an identity as deaf people. So that's a very different experience than hearing sighted people who've never been exposed to, deaf people or sign language or any alternative mode of communication, and then has a child with this experience. So I wanted to frame it in that way, to think like, aha, isn't this interesting? And what are the benefits? And great, this is where you really talk about deaf gain, right? What is the great benefit of having access to a visual language system, and just a perspective on the world that is very different than would be for hearing parents, right? So because I know Heather and know her family, I had asked her if she would make this video for me to talk a little bit about that, and to give an example of the one of millions of then how they have adjusted and tried to figure out how to make their world accessible now to their deaf-blind child, right? So if you give me a second, I'm going to pull up this video. Right now might be a time for a stretch and a sip of water. And I see also, thank you, a parent said, coming as a parent of a medically fragile child who had a feeding tube, so much was lost, right? So in thinking about how much in terms of interventions, right? And how much and what that sense of touch probably looked like for your child and for your family. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, let's see here. Of course, as it goes, there's way too many windows open on your computer. Okay. Okay, do we see that? It says a mom's musings. Do you see? My interpreters, are you seeing that on the screen? Is it black?
Yes.
I'm seeing like a file page with like different video clips in it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. I wanted to make, it's like I was selecting the wrong thing. Please hold. Anyone feel free to direct me. Here we go. Okay, got it. All right. Now we have it, right? All right, so there's going to be signing. So I'm going to go ahead. I'll voice what's on the screen just because I know the clip, and it's mostly visual anyway, but she's just going to set it up a little bit. Just get to the spot where I want to start. Okay. All right, sorry, 1 second. Let me go back just a little bit. All right, so she's saying, so over time with our deafblind child, we knew that we figured out the fact that we needed to be able to provide him tactile information in a consistent way. So people are probably familiar with tactile sign language. We thought, okay, well, he might be able to do that. But his communication skills were still emerging. We call him the grabber. He's a grabber and a mover. So what he would do is he would take the hand of the individual to the thing he wanted. So he would grab the hand of the other person and take it to what he wanted or where he wanted. If he needed help with his food, drink, his seatbelt, whatever the case may be. So we would, of course, sign to him tactily, and we could see that he was starting to grasp them, but his expressive sign skills were not quite there yet. So we'd see sort of one sign at a time, and we would see him produce something and get really excited, and then it would disappear. It wasn't really consistent. So his development wasn't really there yet. But what we knew for a fact is that he knew through the sense of touch. If he touched a spoon, he knew what it was for. He touched the milk, he knew what that was. His diaper. He knows all of his family members. He knows all of us by the sense of touch. And so that's all he really needed. You don't need abstract language to be able to understand what things are through the sense of touch. So that was a key for us to making sure that we maintained this constant sort of feeding of touch to him. So I have many examples I could share with you, but here's an example I want to talk about now. So for example, he loves to be on the bed and just sort of, lounge around, play around. And so if I want to approach him, play with him and interact. But then when I would walk away from the bed, I figured I probably should touch the bed and almost kind of like act like a klutz, right? Like bump along the edge of the bed as I go. So that way, while he's laying there, he knows where I am in the environment. It makes more sense to do that as opposed to stepping away from the bed, not touching the bed, because he would not know where I was in the environment at all until I suddenly appeared in a different location. So I figured by touching the bed, he'd be able to sort of gauge me in the environment and know where I was. So here's the film I want to show you. All right, so here's Orion hanging out. His sign name is O3, Orion, O-R-I-O-N, O3. And so you see he's lounging around. He's got his like little blankie. And she's giving him perhaps some pressure and he says, "Stop touching me." So now watch here, right? What she does, how she described it. All right, so now I want you to take a look. We good, interpreters? You with me? Okay. Yeah. No, I'm just going to describe a little before he moved ahead. I know. Sorry. So I'm going to just describe. So let me back up, right? So before she moves ahead, before she even steps away, I want you to watch what she does with him in the interaction, right? She's touching him, whatever. And I think it's great. He's like, "Get away from me. I'm doing my own thing." And then she does something specific before she walks away. So I wanted to bring your attention to that, number one. And then I want you to watch her hands as she moves across the bed, and then pay attention when she returns in the environment. All right. So it's those couple things. All right. Now here we go. Bam. You see that? Let me do that again.
And interpreter switch.
And we're switching interpreters. Okay, so watch again, right? So as she comes back, so let's go back again. So what she does first, right? She's obviously there playing with him and interacting, but she does something specific right here. So a little pressure, that's one thing that they have their thing. He's like, "Stop touching me." Then she does that. See that little wiggle? She does this, no, right here. She does this little thing on his throat, right? So obviously that's not a sign. That's not a formal sign, right? And so, but here's the beauty of touch. Here's the beauty of consistent and repetitive touch that is connected to meaning, right? That has intention. So obviously this is something that they've designed where when I do this, that means I'm walking away and I'll be right back, right? So it's something that has to be done again consistently over time, so that when she leaves, he has the sense that she will be returning. So then she scaffolds it, right? She does that thing first. Then the second thing she does is what she told us. Then she touches the bed as she goes down. So he's like, "Oh yeah, there she goes." He feels through his sense of discriminative touch, remember, right? he's getting that vibrotactile information, knows exactly where is in the environment, and then is able to do this when she returns in the environment. Perfectly timed. I hope you had a little bit of an aha gasp moment watching this by yourselves in your space, because I can watch this over and over again, and every time I'm floored. Because you think about this, this is a child who is the rarity of the rare, is completely deaf and completely blind. So how else can we get information into this kiddo to help build concepts, to build and scaffold language? And that right there is the absolute power of touch and the consistent best practices put to use. And this is a mom who's coming up with some good ideas, right? And then she went off to and interacted with deafblind adults and understand this whole protactile movement and how I can incorporate touch. But this is a brilliant example of empowering a child through a sense of safety, that knowing that shared tactile exploration, he knows he can reach out and his mother was right there. Like, I don't really know how else better to show that than to show that. Right? Yeah, Aaron was saying in the chat box, it's amazing, right? And it's the simple things like that, but you can tell that, again, paired with some sense of communication. I'm stepping away. I'm going to be right back. That little wiggle on the throat, right? The tap, tap, tap on the bed builds that information, which ultimately will lead to higher level concepts. Pretty cool. You just like, stop watching me, right? I love the toss to the side. And then she signs finish in a hand under hand way. And then she says, did you see that? He knew exactly where I was. And that, of course, was so empowering to me because I knew that the sense of touch made all the difference. So that alone, really amazing. I would encourage you to look her up. She has a series of videos. She has a blog site, and it's actually called that's in the title there, A Mom's Musings. And I'll put the information in the screen in the chat for you. I think also from parent to parent to be able to learn from each other, and just to know that how gut instinct is so powerful, right? Yeah, right. Someone is saying it's amazing how a mom thinks of the details, right? So her name is Heather Withrow, and it's Mom's Musings. So if you want to look her up, she really has an amazing blog, and has some embedded videos on there as well. All right, so that's pretty cool. And I think that because, you know, a lot of times when we think about kiddos and we have these conversations, people are still thinking about, everyone always has a kid in their mind who they're thinking, oh, I remember when I worked with Johnny. Oh, that's who they're talking about. But in fact, people probably are not necessarily thinking of a child who has no access to hearing and no access to vision. This is truly, and so if these components could work brilliantly for a child who is coming into the world in this fashion, obviously they can be extremely successful with techniques across all sorts of learners. All right, so I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. Okay. All right, so now back to some of the other conversation. And again, back to Jude Nicholas, who's on the screen. I had mentioned his work. You know, he does a beautiful job again of pairing the science with the real lived experience. And if we know then that the sense of touch is the first sense to develop, and we know that from that kangaroo care and all that research on that, and it functions even after seeing and hearing begin to fade. So if in fact that truly is the constant sense throughout our lives, this is my soapbox platform then why are we not looking to really benefit from and utilize and maximize the sense of touch, particularly in young learners, to be able to develop all these concepts, and again, to really welcome and invite the sense of touch, again, ultimately leading to more of a self-actualization, which would ultimately lead to more self-determination. So then we get into this idea of, I don't know how much you know about, neuroplasticity, but basically the malleability that the brain has about being able to kind of regenerate itself, right? And you would see this, and you may even know this in your own personal experiences, if you've had someone in your family has had a stroke, right? They've had a significant impact on the brain that without intervention, most likely will remain impacted. But with medical intervention and obviously physical therapy, occupational therapy, and all these sorts of interventions actually can start to regenerate, regrow, and things have the ability to move and replenish itself. And so they say when part of the sensory cortex is not used for a long period of time, the area in that brain literally changes. And so instead of throwing out that area of the brain that is no longer being used, the brain recycles it. So this is fascinating, right? So this comes from some of the work of Dr. Oliver Sacks, right? So Dr. Oliver Sacks was, a neuroscientist who studied this and became fascinated with people with Usher syndrome, because with Usher, right, we talked about that already before, where for the most part, if you have signing folks who have Usher, typically Usher syndrome type 1, who are signers and who relied on their vision their entire lives for communication, could no longer access the visual communication that way, the brain has the capacity to transition from understanding language visually to understanding information through tactile communication. And as a neuroscientist, he was absolutely fascinated by this concept that the brain truly has the ability to interpret linguistic information in a completely different section of the brain. And so that's what this relates to. So let's say that the visual cortex is no longer able to receive enough information to understand, and that starts to fade, that it sort of recycles itself and another part of the brain then gets highlighted. Fascinating stuff. Right? And so this is a good example of, again, this is as far as I go in the area of science, but it is pretty interesting. Like there are primary areas that we know that operate to function certain ways. You see, oh, wow, the auditory information gets processed in this area, and the vision here, and then even the olfactory, remember that whole sense of smell, like they all have spaces. And so that's why it is important, if you have a kiddo who, whether they are congenitally deafblind or come into the world with complications, or if sadly something happens, something traumatic, there's been some sort of, significant impact, that it's really important to get as good a scan of the brain as possible, because these medical experts who know this stuff are then able to see what areas of the brain have been impacted. And if we focus on certain areas, are we able to sort of, quote, light up other parts of the brain? And that's where the medical side of this is, I think, is very, very interesting. Our worlds have always operated pretty separately. Education's over here, medicine's over there. But when we're talking about a human being, we are holistic. That's my plasticity example, right? It's not the brain, but the Olympics are going on and we see all of this, and we know that there is capacity for a lot more plasticity in our bodies than a lot of us are able to do. But looking at that whole system, and I think if we educate ourselves more about the plasticity, could help us understand this a little bit better. And here's a few quotes on that the science truly shows that the human brain is a malleable organ and it responds to the environments. Okay, so that alone, the brain responds to the environments. Okay, we are the environment around the deafblind child. That's us, right? So the child will only respond to what they are given. That's pretty simple, right? It's considered to be a highly dynamic and constantly reorganizing system, capable of being shaped and reshaped across an entire lifespan. Like that's incredible, right? When we think about our kiddos. So it's also the idea of don't give up. I mean, even though we may have missed some of those developmental years, the brain, unless there's some sort of degenerative condition in the brain, right? Or some sort of, nasty, horrific, progressive condition, that we still can reteach, we can help reorganize some of those channels in the brain to understand information better. Doing that through the sense of touch, right? The lifelong capacity of the brain to change and rewire itself in response to the stimulation is this idea of neuroplasticity. And we as educators, we as interpreters, as parents, we have the capacity to impact this. And this is where it really brings home for us. Several studies have shown that the somatosensory cortex, that's the part of the brain that understands touch, is clearly capable of neuroplasticity due to intense haptic or tactile training. Done. That's all we need to know, right? If we know that scientifically there's capacity, that if we bring in the appropriate techniques and we're doing it in a regular, consistent, and respectful manner, it will absolutely stick, right? There's ability for growth. For instance, a neuroimaging study, when they take those images of the brain, have shown that long-term training and tactile discrimination modified from the tactile to visual will have cross-modal responses. So from someone who used to process information visually, they'll be able to process information tactily. So it is just quite fascinating. Somebody's at the door. I'm just saying, we have to answer the door. Okay. So that kind of leads us to this idea of a big movement that's taken place by some amazing pioneers in the field and in the community of deafblindness. So I think some of you have heard of ProTactile, you've heard of haptics, so that's probably a good conversation to have. And ProTactile in its early days, which is actually, this is an image of some of their earlier videos, that has even truly evolved since this all started, but the philosophy remains the same. And so let me set the stage if you're not familiar with ProTactile. So a group of deafblind adults who have Usher syndrome, primarily have Usher syndrome. So this is the experience that we've been talking about through this conversation about someone who had access to vision in their life and was able to function in the world as a sighted person, and then had to change and adapt over time. So these are folks who are empowered individuals who have a voice for themselves and who truly can say, that works, that doesn't work. We're going to switch interpreters, I think. So this is what I'm saying is why it's so important to be able to listen to
Hold
people.
on, Susie. Sorry, I was not prepared for the switch.
Oh, sorry, we weren't spotlight yet.
There we go. We're good.
Great.
Okay, go.
So this is why it's so important to listen to people with lived experience, right? Who have a voice, who can say what you think is accessible to me and what you think works actually doesn't, because we need to hear from those folks who can tell us, because the babies can't tell us, right? And kids with multiple disabilities most likely can't necessarily tell us, other than pushing us away and throwing things and crying, which is all communication, but can't tell us in a way that probably will help us. If you ever had a baby who was colicky, who cried for a long time, all you wanted to know was, what's the matter? What's the matter? Communicate with me, right? So I can fix it. So if we have the tools, we should use them. And so this is why I turned to deafblind adults. So deafblind adults, and so as Jen said in the beginning, I've been doing interpreting with deafblind people my entire career. I have learned from, with, and alongside deafblind people. So I have been shaped in a way that has been extremely helpful, but with more of a traditional sense of tactile sign language. So hand-under-hand communication based on whatever the person tells me works for them, right? We're doing either one-handed communication, we're doing two-handed tactile, sometimes additional touch in different places, but it was more in a traditional sense of I signed the message, therefore I still produce the signs on my body and you just access those signs on me or in our shared space. And that's the way we operated for many, many, many years. Until folks started to say, you know what, that doesn't work so great because you're only trying to add a layer of tactile access on a visual language that is constructed, it's constructed in midair, right? There's no contact space. It is just visual airspace. And for a tactile receiver, even though it's being conducted in a way that includes touch, these folks were able to say, that's not a successful means of communication. So that's how this all started. And also to be able to open up this idea of touch. Why is the world so taboo to touch? And to be able to embrace touch in a way that was inclusive. So, and they talk about this philosophy of PT, that it's not just about, we are pro touch. It's not about pro rah-rah. It's more, but it's more about being productive in the way that we think about touch. And it really is more of a cultural and a cultural experience more than just a linguistic experience. And that helps, I think helps kind of set the stage here. So, let me see before I move ahead. So if you haven't seen, so let me set the stage here. So this is a picture of multiple people communicating. This was a training that I hosted here in New York City. I had brought in 3 different pro-tactile leaders who were able to provide the training, because really, truly, if you want to learn, obviously go to the source, right? Really, we really should be learning directly from deafblind people. And so what's happening here is, this is just more conversational, but you see multiple people with multiple hands involved in a conversation. And that is kind of the basis of the idea of pro-tactile, that if something's happening in the environment, everyone, including the person who maybe can't see or can't see so well, has access to that. So there's a person, the 2 people are seated next to each other, are both deafblind. You can see that they're having tactile communication. The other woman with the blue shirt, it has her hand on the knee of the other individual for feedback in a fluid way in their conversation. And then you have people behind both of the deafblind individuals with their hand or hands on the backs of the deafblind communicators, right? And that could either be environmental information about what's happening truly in the environment. It could be head nods, giving information like, yes, 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 I'm listening to you. So it is a bit of a shift in the way we think about providing, quote, tactile access. And it has absolutely shifted the way that I think about tactile access, even though I have been, quote, pro tactile, you know, all of these years. But it helps us kind of reframe what that means. And we can use a simple example of, let's say I am walking with a deafblind friend and we are approaching an elevator. Well, what do we do when we get to an elevator? Well, most likely you have to push a button, right? You have to make it happen. So in our natural sense is, even if you have someone on your hand or on your arm, even though the person's there, there's this interesting, I think this is an interesting anthropological social study about, even though you have a person here, you know, this is the way we communicate, it's through tactile sign language. It is a natural instinct to reach out with that left hand to press the button. Think about that, right? So even though I'm here with you and I know that this person is a tactile communicator and we're here, but I don't actually use the same hand that the person is engaging with me in. And I bet some of my friends in the room would say like, oh gosh, I'm so guilty of that, right? And it's a simple little choice like that, but it's those simple little movements that actually strips that access. It strips away that person's, really strips away that sort of empowerment that leads to that self-actualization that we were talking about earlier. So I simply just had to go, what was I thinking, right? So if I reach out, that means we both have access to what's in front of us. And if this person has approached an elevator before in their life, and presuming they have, right? Even kids have access to elevators in schools, maybe an elevator in their building, that when I reach out, the second that person feels, oh, the coolness of the wall or the tile on the wall, oh, then knows that I can explore and look for that button. So I can even just be the access person, the guide to that location, and empowering that individual to touch the button themselves. And then they can reach out and wait to feel the door as it shakes, to know that the elevator is coming, and then the door can open and the person can enter. So that one simple little shift in the way we're providing access is so powerful and can be so empowering to that individual. Oh, and Donna is saying, thank you, please. And yes, please put comments here in the chat. It helps me to see if we're on the same page, or if you're like, wait, what does that mean? And Aaron was saying, yes, the brains can process over time. And Donna is saying, thank you. I'm having a hard time understanding until the way we explained it. Yeah, so that's great. Is there a universal sign for Protactile? At this point, it is just PT. It's there. I have a feeling that the community will evolve into something else, but as of now, it's just PT. Sometimes you'll see it referred to as PTL because it is truly evolving into its own recognized separate language. So you may see things referred to more as Protactile language. I think we'll be seeing that more over time. There's an amazing article that came out in the New Yorker about Protactile in the deafblind community, and they did an absolutely fabulous job. They really went to the source, because you think journalism, do you think journalists are really going to understand deafblindness? But they did the right job and they got to the right people. So if you guys don't have that article, I will find it and get it to you. So what do I mean by PT? So PT is just an abbreviation for Protactile. That is the use. So it obviously can get confused with physical therapy, but we're talking about Protactile in this sense, and it's used as PT. So obviously this is literally just an absolute mention of Protactile. I would encourage you to go on to learn more. There's lots of videos out there. I'm going to show you, before our time ends today, I want to show you one or two more things. But I know there's also conversation about haptics. And that sometimes is signed this way. There might be a little wiggle on the chest, and also haptics, almost like a moving sort of X, like almost like hand. And people have often been confused, and I was too earlier in my career, about the difference between the two. And there is a very significant difference. And so haptics is not a new concept, but it's the idea of access through touch. But there was a system of haptics that was developed in the Scandinavian countries. And we kind of laugh, because if we know our interpreting programs here in the United States, we have something like, 150 different interpreting programs that maybe have different philosophies and different approaches and things like that, because we are a very, very large country. Well, if you live in, Norway, you could probably count the number of deaf people in the whole country very easily. And so they had more easy access to develop a system that was standardized, that every single person graduating from an interpreter training program would leave with the same skill sets, and that included haptics. And so they alongside with a deafblind leader there, designed this approach of a set structure of types of touches for empowering a deafblind person about what's in their environment. So, but it is a very set, limited set of touches. And I think that there's 64 in total, I think around that. And with great intention, like the arm is used, and there's different places to use on the arm, the use of the back, sometimes the use of the leg, like the upper thigh. And the whole idea is, but to use it in a way that is very set, like this is for colors, this is for temperatures, this is for, that are in very specific locations. So it's a touch, it's a layer of touch access on top of language. That alone is not a language. And it's also not extremely fluid, right? As opposed to protactile language it has evolved up and beyond, far beyond that. And it is more of an overall encompassing relational, two-person, multi-person means of access to touch, access to communication through touch that has evolved now more into language. And so, and also has kind of taken the idea of traditional tactile sign language and kind of flipped it over. Like I was saying before, how even though we were providing tactile access to language and the receivers of that information were very savvy, fluent communicators, we were still producing the signs more on our body or in the air. And so one good example about the difference between those two is, let's say I'm interpreting, I'm providing, or even just telling a story. I mean, it could be a mom and their child having conversation. It doesn't have to be an interpreter. But let's say I was saying, well, here's the tree. The person's hand is on my hand, right? Through tactile sign language. And I'm saying, here's the tree. And the cat climbed up the tree. Well, now we've just complicated things, right? So here's a tree and the person's in contact with me. Well, I'm going to need that other person's second hand, which is very common for tactile sign language. So, okay, so, but then they'd have to bring their hand up to mine if I'm saying the cat is here, and then they have to follow me, right? And then, oh, the cat climbed up the tree, but they're over here. So the deafblind person is still having to look for information and trying to build this concept about what are all the pieces, what are these things? So then a deafblind person's perspective, when you take it and flip it in a protactile perspective, is then I actually would produce that interaction on their hand with using their body. So I would give them the shape of the tree. I'd say, hey, give me your hand. They give me their hand in this shape. And then I produce the cat did this and landed on the limb. So do you see how that is a very different way? And so then the person has a direct tactile relational connection to that language. I don't know if that makes sense, because I kind of live and breathe in this stuff. And so I may be saying it in a way that is hard to absorb, especially across, technology. So let me know if that made sense. And if not, I can help clarify that. Thanks, Jen, for the article in the New Yorker. I would absolutely encourage everyone to read that. That will help give you a really good perspective on, or an base understanding about protactile. Okay, good. We're getting hopefully some thumbs up. Makes sense. All right, great. Yeah. All right, we'll switch interpreters. So protactile language allows deafblind people to give, receive, and exchange information through the tactile channel as the primary means of access, getting away from relying on vision and getting away from relying on hearing. And so not to say, and fluent protactile users will still say, hey, if you can use some vision, if you can use some hearing, by all means. This is not an anti, other channels. It's more of, how can we enhance access to that person's world? And that is through the sense of touch. All right. All right, I'm keeping an eye on the time, so I think we're in good shape. So this is hot off the press, and I don't even know if my colleagues in the room even know this. So there is a grant that is being facilitated to study the use of these protactile techniques that adults are using with young deafblind children. And this is exactly what we have needed. And so the cool part is that their first module was just released to highlight what they're talking about when they talk about protactile and this concept of co-presence that I mentioned before, being with, doing with, not for, doing at the same time, reaching for the elevator, allowing the person to explore, to touch the button themselves. That's the idea of co-presence, right? Having a constant shared experience. So this is super cool. It's hot off the press. It's on YouTube. It's available to anyone. So I'd like to stop here, show you, I'm gonna switch over to YouTube to show you this. The video is about 5 minutes and it just builds a nice foundational exposure, okay? So look at that cutie little patootie on the lap there, right? All right, so let me stop the share and I'm gonna go over, see if I can get this right.
Susie, can you handle a question while you're doing that?
Yeah,
Because here's a good one for you. How do you manage with a child who's resistant to tactile communication? I use other methods in communicating, but he doesn't like a lot of touch with signing.
yep. We get that question all the time and it is almost expected. So what I would say in that essence is kind of to go back to the very beginning about what was the child's early exposure to touch? What was the child's introduction to touch, right? So we have to think about truly, I would go back and even think like, what is the etiology? What is the cause of this child's experience, right? Do they have Charge syndrome? Do they have Down syndrome and also have vision and hearing issues? What was their early entree into the world? Were there medical interventions? The studies show that kids with Charge syndrome, we've talked about Charge a lot. Kids with Charge, Sherry, you can do here too. It's CH or CS off the shoulders. Yeah, Charge. Decided by young adults who have Charge, which is the best way to go. That by the time they've reached even elementary school, like by 3rd grade, they could have easily have had 20 or 25 surgeries, and other kids even more. So if you think about that, by the time they get to you, you can guarantee that kid is going to be, quote, resistant to touch because they've had an aversive negative experience, right? So that's what I would just challenge you to think about. Oftentimes we hear kids are tactily defensive. There's a reason for that. Think about the educational team, right? Oftentimes we have an educational team. It could have 10 providers. I bet every one of those 10 providers approach that child a different way. And does that mean that when they approached the kid, they knew that he was a tactile communicator, so they went right to his hand and he pulled away, right? Did someone touch him on this shoulder and then someone touched him on that shoulder? So we have to think about absolute consistency of touch as we approach a child and respectful hand use. So those are the things that I would challenge us all to really think about. Because if there was negative experiences, and I can guarantee 100% that child has had negative experiences related to touch, no doubt. So we have to figure out if we can kind of unlearn those. All right. Yeah, I think we have some folks who might be unmuted. So just if you want to mute yourself, that would be great. And I'm going to go ahead and pull up well, I say I'm going to pull it up. Let me see. 1 second, please.
Susie, this is Cheryl. Will the video need interpretation?
I don't think so. I don't think so. It has captions and it's mostly watching, I think. So let's take a look. Let me see and we'll test it out. Okay.
Will I need a video description?
That's another good question. Yes, why don't we stay on? So then if I have to describe anything, we'll do that. Thank you for the reminder. Okay, here we go. All right, so here's what this it looks like. Protactile Kids.
Welcome to Protactile Kids, Lesson 1, Co-Presence, Introduction of an Object. Meet Jonan and his caregiver, Darcy. They will model some examples of co-presence in introducing objects. To introduce an object to your deafblind child, begin with a touch at the shoulder. Darcy is holding the bottle in her hand and touching the side of the bottle to Jonan's shoulder. Next, slowly slide the object under your child's arm, like in this second picture, where Darcy moves the bottle down the back of Jonan's arm. At this point, your child will feel the object at their hand. Notice in the third picture, Jonan has the bottle at his hand with Darcy supporting it. Over time, they will begin to associate this movement with you offering them an object, and their hand will clasp what you are offering. Let's watch those 3 steps put together in motion. Darcy supports Jonan's hand with her free hand, touches the bottle to his shoulder, sweeps down the outside of his arm, and ends at his hand. Now watch that sequence again. Here you see where the object makes contact on the shoulder. Here you see Darcy sliding the object down the arm, ending at the hand. Now Jonan knows where the bottle that Darcy is offering is. Once Jonan knows the bottle is there, he lets Darcy know he wants it by fussing. If your child becomes frustrated, it's time to take a little break. They're learning something new. Once they have settled down, try again. In this part of the video, you can see Darcy and Jonan exploring the bottle together. This is forming tactile awareness. Taps on the baby's hand shows your encouragement and affirmation. This cycle of interacting tactically with an introduced object and expressions of affirmation form co-presence with your child. Co-presence is important for your child to feel included and connected. Sighted people receive information by looking, seeing what others are doing and how they're doing it. Sighted babies look at their caregivers, objects, and favorite toys. A deafblind child needs to get this information through touch. Your child can feel you, the objects surrounding them, and recognize their favorite toys by touch. Engaging in activities with your child through touch allows them to be aware of what is happening around them. Consistent co-presence is the foundation of language development. Now let's introduce the basics of co-presence and protactile. Sighted and protactile communication have equivalent communication points. First is awareness. Awareness of another person's presence is obtained by touch in protactile. This is similar to looking at or seeing each other. Touch your baby so they know you are there. Do activities with your baby in your lap so they know you are there doing things together. This is just like other children who see their caregiver close to them. When giving an object to your child, avoid startling them by introducing objects starting at their shoulder first and sliding it down their arm. This is like your child seeing an object before you give it to them. Darcy touching the bottle to Jonan's shoulder and sliding it down his arm is introducing it by touch. This is the same as a baby seeing a bottle being handed to them. When interacting with your child, give them encouragement to engage. Tapping your child gently on their body, shoulder, arm, or leg is a way of giving your nod of approval or encouragement. A caregiver can use physical contact and tapping to let the child know they are doing good in the same way they might use eye contact and nod their head. Darcy is tapping on Jonan's little arm to let him know he is doing a good job at drinking his milk. It's like she's saying, "This is good." When interacting, it's important to give affirmation with positive reinforcement. In protactile, this is done by tapping your hand on their arm, chest, or leg. Gentle taps inform them that you are cheering them on. Darcy is telling Jonan he is doing a great job. This is affirmation in PT. More taps on Jonan's leg tell him to keep it up, he's doing great. Communication continues as Jonan sits in Darcy's lap, feels her presence, engages in co-presence in the same focused activity, and gets reinforcement with gentle taps. Language can happen anywhere the two are in contact. Here, Darcy tells Jonan to keep sucking by making a slight squeezing motion with her fingers along Jonan's leg and knee. The PT word for suck is shown in this part of the video. Notice how Darcy uses her hand to indicate that Jonan is sucking on his bottle. The movement is on his body so he can feel what Darcy is saying. By associating this protactile word with an affirmative tap of the hand, she's saying, "Great job drinking your bottle." Here's a close-up of the PT word for suck. Darcy pulls her fingers together along Jonan's knee while he sucks at the bottle. And there we see a happy hand tap on his knee, letting him know she is pleased with what he is doing. Jonan contentedly drinks his bottle, and when he stops, Darcy lets him know that that's okay too, by some more soft taps on his knee. Darcy reintroduces the bottle by touching at the shoulder and sliding down the arm. Here we see Jonan touch the tip of the bottle and not throw his arm out. He understands that his bottle is there if he wants it. Practice co-presence with your child by keeping in contact while you engage, using your legs or lap or torso. Touch and explore objects together and provide affirmation by using soft taps on their arm, chest, or leg. When introducing an object, touch the object to your child's shoulder and slide it down their arm to their hand. Make sure they know how pleased you are with them by using light taps as affirmation. Communicate with your child by producing PT words on their body to talk about what you two are doing together, such as the PT word for suck.
All right, so some pretty cool stuff, right? So this is just new, evolving, again, looking at techniques that adults are doing and how can we apply them to young learners. And that was a great example. And I know Erin had mentioned the idea of respectful touch, right? So this is a great example. The idea of, we've always talked about, before ProTactile came around, we talked about once you first introduce yourself to a deafblind person, right? Even if you know they're tactile communicators, you're not going to go right in under the hand. You want to make sure you come in a way that's not intrusive and respectful, coming in at the shoulder, you know, placing your hand on the shoulder, waiting for that individual to turn to you, as opposed to kind of forcing your means of communication onto that individual. So that's a great example. How do we start this in introducing touch that is respectful, welcoming, and is less sensitive? And so, like Erin was saying, right, your sensory components here are less sensitive in terms of reception as opposed to in the palm and on the top of your hand. So there's physiological reasons for it and other reasons why we want to do things like that. Yeah, we definitely need a PT dictionary, lots of new concepts, lots of new words. I am with you on that. And all I can say about that is stay tuned for all of us, because it really is just evolving and growing kind of like right in front of our eyes. Jen is saying, please complete the evaluation. I'm just going to finish up with one or two more things. I know it's time for us to wrap up, and I appreciate you hanging in there. So this is just a way to wrap it up that you can see, I think, based on this conversation, that it is a cyclical positive fashion. If we, increase positive touch, it truly has a neuroscientific component where it increases the neural pathways, which it increases those connections in the brain and externally, which leads to this idea of more self-actualization, a more self-awareness, and more self-determination. And that's really ultimately what we are aiming for, right? That's kind of the goal. And in future times, we can come back and give more examples of what touch looks like. And especially because almost, all of our learners really are multimodal communicators. And so consider that when you're thinking about of communication. It's not only one size fits all, it's really multiple sizes, and we have to consider what works best. But again, most of our kiddos are multimodal communicators, and I would just encourage you to get touch in there as much as you can. And we learn as we go, right? So thank you for putting the link to the article that I mentioned, the PT article, and look up Heather on her blog site. And also someone mentioned she does have a Facebook page. So check that out. We want to learn from the best examples. So on that note, I see it's 4 o'clock on the nose and it is a Friday afternoon. So I don't want to keep you. I want to say thank you to our great interpreters. Thanks for your flexibility and working with me. And thank you to the Maryland Connections Beyond Sight and Sound Project for asking me to join you all today.
Susie, can you put the link to that YouTube video that we just watched in the chat box?
I sure can.
I can send that out, as well as the link to the article when I send out recording links.
Yes, and I hope that this was helpful for folks and gave a little insights into just at least the way my brain thinks about touch from the adult perspective, kiddos, some of the neuroscience that we have available to us. Because I think that we all want to do the best, and we can just continue to learn, and grow together. So great. That's so great. Thanks so much, Donna. And thanks everybody.